jumpstart it, and it paid off.
Yeah, very cool. So I know now, what is it? You spent about 4 years or so on Daredevil?
Yeah, a little over four
Okay.
years, close to five. There were a couple like little gaps in there where I took time off for working on a little mini series, or maybe I was moving or getting married or something in between there. But yeah, I mean, there was was a good run.
Okay. So what I don't want to get into, like, why they took you off the book or how all that went down. People can do their research and read about that online if they want. Uh, it seems unfortunate and ill-timed in all that,
Yes, both of those. I will say that. Yes.
you know. But what I did find, so very interesting then was that yes, they sort of unceremoniously took you off the book.
Yep.
But then, some years later, I'd sort of say have the nerve to come back and ask you to write the closing issue of the first volume of Daredevil. That issue number 380 with Lee.
380. Yep. Yep. With Lee
And
Weeks. Yep.
and then you get to do the Daredevil Batman crossover too, another book that seems like anybody would, give their eye to get to be the one who writes. Like, how did that all feel and such here to, like, be kicked off this book, but then some years later, them come back and say, hey, will you close it for us? And then somebody else saying, hey, will you write this, intercompany crossover that happens once in a blue moon?
Right. Right.
How did that all feel?
Well, it's interesting, Troy, for to hear your and see your interpretations, which I completely understand. Um, in their own way, both of those were gifts to me, right? Because on the one hand, Daredevil 380, which was the last issue of Daredevil Volume 1 before the book would then be handed over to Kevin Smith and
Mhm.
Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada. Um, uh, there you go, boom, and dedicated to Archie Goodwin, I might add.
Oh yeah, I got that
Uh,
in there.
yeah, there you go, there you go. Uh, um, the editor, on the book, uh, who I'm gonna say this because I know no other way to say it right now, but was, and it takes nothing away from his capabilities or his abilities, was sort of the lame duck editor on the book, right? He had Daredevil. They knew it was going over to this big profile Palmiotti, Quesada, Kevin Smith thing, right? So his stewardship of the book at the end of this first volume run was sort of just get the last couple issues out of there. Well, he really didn't like where the book had been going when it had been handed over to him. He felt the stories were not doing justice to what Daredevil should be. And so when he called me and said exactly that, in essence, right? I don't like where the stories have been going. I don't think this does the work well. This is nothing like what you and Lee did, right? And so he sort of was holding that up as like a high water mark, or one of the high water marks. I think almost anybody who works on Daredevil pushes themselves more to do justice to the character, except for that team that was working on it, perhaps before that last issue. Um, would you guys come back and just end this with a bang? With a, really like put your all into this. And I was struggling. Like this was toward the end of my comics run altogether. Like jobs were not coming in, things weren't working out well. Um, so it was a gift just in terms of a job, but also to hear him say that, like the work you did
Mhm.
mattered. And, and then I had to convince Lee to do it, right? Because Lee didn't want to do it. I think, he had been contacted, in the same kind of, cell, but Lee didn't want to go. Lee felt it was like going backwards, right? It was like, I've done this, I've achieved this, I've already made my mark on this. I don't want to go back and do like an also ran thing. So we had a long conversation, about it, saying that this can be something different. This can be its own thing. And gr Thankfully, gratefully, he came around and allowed us to kind of recapture, that spark, which it really is. Working with Lee is like nothing else. Lee will always be, my Daredevil artist as much as I've enjoyed working with other people, and I have. Um, that's the one I sort of achieved the first best stuff with. And so that was kind of a gift, even though it sort of felt like, well, you're off the book. Why are they, of all the people, why are they coming after you? It wasn't the people who had undiplomatically, inelegantly removed me from the book. Not to get into that, sordid history, but it was somebody who respected the work that had been done and recognized that and was offering an opportunity, for this. Um, and then on the Daredevil Batman crossover, which is called An Eye for an Eye, which was the first of I think three Daredevil Batman crossovers they would ultimately do. Um, when that Fall from Grace worked out as well as it did, like sales wise, all of a sudden there was a little white heat around Daredevil that hadn't been there before. And Ralph and I had used that to leverage a number of projects into motion at the same time. There was going to be a Daredevil Year Two series. There was going to be a Daredevil time travel story with Paul Ryan that was going to be pretty cool and trippy. There was a couple. There was another. We did one Elektra series. There was going to be another Elektra series, and then there was this Batman Daredevil crossover. So all of these things were in motion. They were like, in development. They were, going through whatever the sales approval process, the publication approval process rather, and then the book was removed from Ralph's office. The title, the character of Daredevil, was removed from Ralph's office and put into another office. So all those projects went up in smoke, never to be seen again, except for the Daredevil Batman one, which kind of existed in this little weird limbo. Ralph somehow kept hold of that, but it then fell from like, well, this is going to happen next week to the long walk. It sort of became the slow walk, I should say, rather. Um, and so what was supposed to happen immediately just kept taking more and more time. Are we ever going to do this? Lee was originally the artist on that as well. Lee was going to be the artist on that, and then finally a combination of time and what they had originally committed to him as his page rate changed. So he said, no, I'm not doing this. If you're not going to honor your commitments, to it, then I got to go somewhere else. And then we, brought it up to Scott, and Scott was not an also ran, but Scott was different than Lee, so that changed some approaches in the story. So, while that came out actually years later, right, in effect, or a couple of year and a half later, um, that had actually been sort of like in development, like in the midst of when I was very deep in the Daredevil world. So, but ultimately, both of them turned out to be, as I said, gifts in the sense of I'm very proud of how both of them turned out. I have more problems with Daredevil Batman than I do with that last one good story, one from Daredevil 380.
Mhm.
But I think they both have some, pretty good merit to them.
Okay, very cool. Well, thank you for that. Now, um,
Yeah.
I do want to bring up some slides to illustrate a point that I was again noticing with your writing, and let me just pull these up real quick because I did find it interesting, and again something that I don't recall seeing in that many other writers. And obviously, I've read a few comics in time, but um, just a few. But your tendency to often having people dropping in other language. We've got your one character here in Daredevil who loves throwing out
Oh,
Latin
Lamar, yes.
whenever he can.
Right.
Um, because I mean, you kept the character consistent. Here it is, 25 years ago. Here it is last year. He's talking
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Latin again. Um,
At
did
least
you
he
have a
stays
did you have a
consistent. You're
minor in
right.
Latin back in college, or what the hell here?
No, but that became,
Is it?
that was his gimmick, right? This Lamar character was sort of like just this old soul wandering around the new neighborhood that Matt
Mhm,
Murdock's pseudo identity, comes to occupy in Alphabet City, when he's trying to kind of maintain the
mhm,
idea that he's dead. He takes on this Jack Batlin
mhm,
identity. Everyone thinks Matt Murdock has been killed. Um, Lamar was like one of the people I populated the neighborhood with, and so he was always supposed to be like a continuing, like I said, old soul character, and sometimes as a writer you give you give characters gimmicks to start to kind of
Mhm.
like, do it. Do they have like an actor, like I mean, Vincent D'Onofrio is beyond in terms of his performance as the Kingpin. But look at the stuff he does with his hands. He does little like twitches and like motions with his hands to indicate certain things.
Mhm.
So the gimmick for this Lamar character was that in my head he had been a university professor. He had taught like perhaps Latin or ancient studies. Never was going to come out. I wasn't going to do a 2x4 explanation of that. But
Mhm.
I figured that little bit would be like his calling card, a little bit of a Latin phraseology to throw it out there. So that was his
Mhm.
thing back in the day. And then I was coming back and doing this more modern series, which was still set in that time period, right? Let's get as
Right.
confusing as we possibly can.
Mhm.
um,
Yes, and so he was
I
still doing it,
he was still doing
obviously.
it, and Fabian Nicieza, I wasn't looking for advice, but Fabian is never shy about giving advice. And I love Fabian, so let's be clear about that. Uh, we went out to lunch and, I was talking about, they're talking about offering me this retro Daredevil miniseries to kind of go back and do it. And he had done some of those series of his own. I think he had done a cable one and, a few others, I'm sure. But he said, you know what? Write it like you never stopped writing it. Like go into it as if you never stopped writing the book. And I thought it was like just perfect, because if I had written the next issue of Daredevil, right, just as I was doing, Lamar would have showed up. This Randy character who becomes the sort of love interest for Matt would have had a scene.
Mhm.
So why not create that continuance and enrich them in the process? Lamar becomes a little bit more interesting because I know how to make Lamar a little bit more interesting now.
Mhm.
Randy becomes like just some bimbo-ish character who Matt might hook up with and becomes an important sort of impetus for, saying to him, you have a responsibility to do what you do best, for the people you're supposed to be defending in so many words. So that's where you create that continuance of a character like that. And I have to tread the line of like, does that ex aquio et bono serve the story, or am I just showing you how well read I am? Or I know how to use Google Translator these days.
Well, and again, that is what I was like, what is he doing? Because then we've got, Strucker, doing the same thing, like in this particular issue, he mentions this word Wertlos at least
Right,
like, two or three times prior before we get like our translation of it.
right,
Uh, in that issue 380 of Daredevil, we've got some Hoi Moon Daikat going on. So
right.
um I know my interpretation of well that's not foreign, but my interpretation was, by including like these different phrases and languages other than English, it was like this great reminder that even the world that these characters exist within is larger than just American English. And
Yeah, and there's lovely phrases. I mean, "Heu
yeah.
mun dicot wertlos," which, at that point, he says, means worthless. Again, sometimes phrases just pop out to you, right? Um, so much of Strucker's character and drive in that particular um, Daredevil story, that Daredevil Black Armor story, was driven by a book by Douglas Rushkoff called Survival of the Richest, which is a nonfiction book about oligarchs, and way too rich people who have basically a plan to survive what they call the event, where the world goes to, can I swear? You
Go for
know,
it.
the world goes to shit, and we're all left to suffer, and they get to survive, and the mentality, and he interviewed these people. These people had brought him in as a futurist and a strategist to say, well, how do we survive? What should we be doing? And so he used that as a kind of a backdoor reverse engineered entrance to learn more about their personalities. And so their outlook on life was so much like, unless anyone on here is a billionaire, trillionaire, and if you are, I hope you've earned it well. um, is just this horrible, demeaning look on it. So things like using phrases like that I might have jotted down while I was researching something, it's nice to sort of like pepper the language with, um, and as you said, make it feel like the world is bigger and more enriched, and has little bits of flavor, as long as it ultimately doesn't leave the reader confused. My best friend is a not even one of my best friends. My best friend is Greg Wright, who wrote a lot of things, in the old days. Silver Sable is a very phenomenal artist, phenomenal colorist, and is often my creative sort of feedback loop. I'll send him something and he'll rip it apart and tell me, "Yeah, you got maybe one good idea there," and go back to work. But he's read more than one thing of mine and said, "Stop trying to tell people how well read you are and just tell the damn story." So I have to, right? Exactly. So I have to balance that, between incorporating something that enriches the story and just, showing you, well, yeah, I pulled that out of here. Isn't that cool? Not so much. That stops the story cold again. And I think
Very
those
good. Well,
instances you put up there, I think they do add to the story more than stop it cold.
yeah, yeah, I definitely agree. I do want to before it gets buried in the chat, I do want to mention that one question about somebody saying the Wikipedia entry on Terror Inc. says that Marcus McLaurin said Shrek and Terror weren't the same person, and you said they were. Did the two of you ever work that out?
Marcus knows where it came from. Marcus is a smart man. He knows exactly what. But when Marcus said that, he was a team player for Marvel, and Marvel was not acknowledging that it was a Shadowline thing. But yeah, we all know where he came from, and there's plenty of places where Terra winks, at the reader, and makes allusions to his origin and so forth. So that was Marcus being a quote unquote company man, and I think I saw him I know I saw him on a podcast at one point where we were laughing about that, and I think he was denying ever saying it. So
Okay. Well, you've been like very generous with your time, but I do want to like share a few more slides and just get some like feedback or
yeah,
response
whatever you want. I'm
from you
good
there
wherever you
because
guys want to go. And I know there's a lot of questions I haven't been paying attention to in the side, so if something pops out, let me know if
right.
we
Well,
need to
let,
answer
let, let
something.
me hop through these here, and then we'll check back and see if there's some more questions there. But the first one I want to mention about is the horniest villain I've ever seen in
Ah!
Marvel, and you know, uh, what was the story here, man? I mean, I know I've read some of the story, but like, where in the world did like, I'm gonna take over the world through sex come from?
Sexual energy, yeah. Well, I think so if folks want to search this story out, and it is a pretty good story, I would say. It's very strange, this villain Priapus, which in its own way basically means, I think, engorged male genitalia, which nobody recognized at Marvel until Bob Budiansky was reviewing the book one day and was like, "What are you guys trying to get away with?" And we weren't trying to get away with anything. It was all just sort of like true to the storyline. Um, so and it's a crossover between Terror Incorporated, Silver Sable, which Greg Wright was writing, and Luke Cage, which Mark McLaurin was writing. So it's a six-part crossover, and it keeps looping back between the three of them. And we were able to work out the whole story amongst ourselves. Um, but we blame Clive Barker for this, actually, totally, because we had all at one point worked heavily in Clive's world. I'd worked on Hellraiser and Nightbreed, and Marcus had taken over Hellraiser for me at one point, and also did the Razor line, the Clive Barker universe, and uh, um, Greg had edited Jihad, um, as well as I think a couple other things. So when you're in Clive's world, things like this seem very normal. They seem very ordinary. It's like, yeah, that's the way the world is. So I think that, for us, it was like, yeah, why not do a story about a sex demon and, him trying to kind of take over the world with this twisted artifact, that puts people into that state of mind so he can control them. Um, So it's it's a bit of a trip, but I ultimately I will defend the fact that it actually does work as a story, and that we had a ball sort of passing the baton from mercenary character to mercenary character and setting it up so that we could each take it and run to the next chapter of the story. And my one regret is that, and maybe there wasn't enough time with Terror after the fact. I don't think it lasted much longer, but uh, we had such a great rapport amongst ourselves, but also the characters had a great rapport. They really, there's, they were antagonistic, but there was good chemistry. And it's funny
Mhm.
that they never picked up on it again in, future issues.
Okay. I think this is one of the best lines I've seen in a comic book. You know, this is from the Critical Mass series for the rest of you there. I just saw that.
Yeah,
I was like, this is awesome.
it's unfortunately rather a bit too timely right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, like we've talked about online, there's a few scenes you've had in these comics from like literal decades ago that seem so pertinent and relevant now. It blows my mind.
Right, right. Yeah, I wish I wasn't so prescient about certain things.
With pages like this, I was just wondering
Yeah.
from a technique standpoint, who determines the pacing here? Who's saying I want it to go from one panel to three panels to four panels to four panels? How does that
This
work?
is a this I would say is all Klaus Janson. This is, just another testament to his like skill as a storyteller and as I said, me and Margaret wrote and then I would go on to write on my own, I think fairly detailed plots. And sometimes you do, talk about panel breakdowns and like, there should be a big panel and then a small panel or, three panels across the top and then a big splash panel. But typically with Klaus and St. George, and unfortunately, I lost all my original writing in a hard drive crash, like back in 2001. So anything I'd written up to that point was gone. Um, uh, so I couldn't tell you exactly how we wrote it, but we would write page 1 to 5, all this happens. Page 7, maybe it might be a splash page on its own. Page 8 to 15, this happens, that kind of thing. And we would again be detailed. And a lot of times when me and Margaret would work through things, or I would do it the same later, we would think about, all right, this works as an individual image. They're falling off the back of the plane. So and so is hanging on to St. George, and starting to pull him off. Michael looks over his shoulder. All these little bits and pieces. We would sort of write out almost a paragraph would almost in our heads indicate a panel. We wouldn't say panel 1, panel 2. We'd beat it out, that way. But then it's to somebody like Klaus to decide, well, I can do that in 3 panels or I can do this in a grid. So, here's an instance of, him extending time. He could have just done that last thing as the guy falling, right? Done. But by extending time, it makes it more effective, more impactful, as a matter of
Mhm.
fact. And then this is why I really love, for myself, writing plot and then script, is because then when you get a story like this back, it changes how you're going to do it, right? Suddenly you realize those two mid panels in that bottom row, need to be silent, and have whatever is being said, in that last one, maybe stick the landing. But if you write it as a full script up front, yeah, you've got everything on the page, but maybe you miss out on some of the magic that happens when you get to see the art. There was a fight scene in one of the Scott McDaniel Daredevil ones that always sticks in my head, and I had written it as like a double page like spread, and he was fighting a bunch of the Hand probably or something like that, and in my mind's eye, I had, and I probably put this in the plot. There's going to be all this dialogue and all this, caption, caption, caption to kind of carry things through. But then Scott gives back this just outrageously effective single image spread across these 2 pages. And, my caption became maybe 4 words, done, because everything else was there and beyond. It took it to a whole different place. So you try to be mindful of the energy that something like this creates. But yeah, this is all Klaus.
Okay, it's just one of those neat reminders, truly, that like comic books is a collaborative medium, and
Oh yeah, so much.
that your collaborator can surprise you sometimes.
Always, almost always. Sometimes they surprise you badly, but I've had only a handful of those.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. This is from the final issue of Terror.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Richard Pace did such a nice like homage here.
yeah, did a fantastic work there. And again, um, if I can get just like a a brief-ish response about what did it feel like having to close this book, because it was a great final issue, but you could tell as a reader that, my gosh, there were more stories you wish you could have told about this weirdo, and
Yeah,
you tried to tie it up nicely. What was it like closing Terror?
I like your diplomatic, a brief answer, since I have a tendency to ramble. I will do this. So no, it was bittersweet. I mean, obviously, I love the character. As you said, we saw many opportunities to do much more with it, and they had actually promised us several more issues to get the sales up. Like the sales weren't well, and they sort of said like, listen, you're going to have through, I want to say like at least 15, I want to say even like 17, to kind of get the sales up. And then as we were in the middle of this story, I think, we got the word that no, this is the last issue. So, we had to wrap it up, and so that added to it. But Richard did such a wonderful job altogether, and then this last little coda, made it very nice.
Yeah, well, very cool. It's you know whether it comes to books or to movies, that one of the neatest things I had somebody say to me was that uh, generally speaking, when you complain about somebody not being able to stick the landing or hit the third act of a film well, it's because well, it's not necessarily that the job isn't to do the ending well. The job is to like get you to read the book in the first place, or to get your butt in the movie seat. So the hook of getting somebody in is often more important than finishing it up well. And
Hmm.
though this wasn't when or where you wanted it to end, you still managed to like hit a good landing, which I think is a difficult thing to do, especially under those circumstances. So,
Hmm.
cheers to you in there.
No,
It's
thank
hard
you.
to
Yeah.
stick the landing.